In the dry heat of an afternoon, a rich man with a hard stare steps out of a luxury car in front of his mansion. In his arms, a newborn baby covered in a thin cloth breathes shallowly. Silently, the man walks through shocked guests toward the lion's cage tied in the back. A sweaty, agitated horse pulls at the reins and watches. Without a word, the man lifts the baby and throws it. The impact against the bars shatters the silence. The horse breaks free and gallops toward the danger. But what it does next defies everything you believe is possible. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and never miss one. Thanks for following. Now, back to our story. In the rolling hills of Virginia's horse country, where old money whispered through ancient oak trees and new fortunes screamed from marble facades, Maxwell Harrington III hosted what the local papers would call the event of the season. His estate, Crescent Ridge, sprawled across 200 acres of the most coveted land in Fauquier County, its pristine white fences containing thoroughbreds worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. The main house, a colonial monstrosity of columns and glass, gleamed in the late September sun as caterers and staff scurried about like ants, preparing for the annual harvest gala. Maxwell stood at his bedroom window, adjusting the platinum cufflinks on his tailored shirt. At 48, he remained trim and imposing, his salt and pepper hair expertly styled to project both vigor and gravitas. The financial papers called him the Acquisitions King, a title he'd earned through 20 years of corporate takeovers that left broken companies and shattered lives in his wake. But tonight wasn't about business. Tonight was about showcasing his newest acquisition, a private collection of exotic animals that would cement his reputation as not just wealthy, but exceptional. Mr. Harrington, the first guests are arriving, his house manager announced from the doorway. Maxwell didn't turn. And the exhibition area? Ready, sir. The handlers are in position. The animals have been fed, except as you instructed. Good. Maxwell smiled at his reflection. The enclosures had cost nearly $2 million to build, a state-of-the-art facility hidden behind the Rose Garden, where glass barriers would allow his guests to observe the lions, tigers, and other predators up close. The centerpiece, a magnificent male lion he'd named Caesar, had been specially transported from a defunct zoo in Texas. Tonight's finale would be unforgettable. As he descended the grand staircase, he caught sight of the child sitting alone in the corner of the entrance hall. The boy, 7, maybe 8 years old, wore a simple white shirt and black pants that marked him as someone's son reluctantly brought along. His unruly brown hair and freckled face contrasted sharply with the polished opulence around him. For a moment, their eyes met, and Maxwell felt an unfamiliar ripple of discomfort before turning away. "Jonathan, whose child is that?" he asked a passing server. "That's Mrs. Wheeler's grandson, sir. His mother works in the kitchen. There was some emergency with the babysitter." Maxwell frowned. "Keep him out of sight. This isn't a daycare." Outside, the party hummed with the artificial energy of the privileged. Women in designer gowns air-kissed across cocktail tables, while men in bespoke suits discussed tax shelters and market forecasts. Maxwell moved through them like a shark through shallow water, accepting compliments on the champagne, the caviar, the perfect weather he seemed to have ordered specifically for the occasion. "Maxwell, darling, you've outdone yourself," cooed Elaine Vanderholt, widow of a banking executive and now the self-appointed social arbiter of the county. "Everyone's talking about this surprise you've planned." "Patience, Elaine," he replied, kissing her powdered cheek. "Some things can't be rushed." Beyond the immediate gathering, in the sweeping pastures that led to the woods, a solitary figure caught Maxwell's eye. A young woman in worn jeans and A flannel shirt was leading a powerful black stallion toward the stables. Even at this distance, Maxwell could appreciate the animal's magnificent conformation. High withers, powerful hindquarters, a proud neck that arched as if the horse knew its own worth. Unlike the meticulously groomed show horses in his stables, this animal had a wild quality that made his other acquisitions seem suddenly lifeless. "Who's that?" he asked his stable manager, who hovered nearby with a tray of hors d'oeuvres for the guests. "That's Midnight, sir, and Sarah Dawson, the new trainer you hired last month." "I don't remember hiring her." "Your office approved it when Thompson left. She has a way with the difficult ones. That stallion was considered unrideable before she came." Maxwell watched as the woman stopped and pressed her forehead against the horse's muzzle, speaking words he couldn't hear. The stallion stood perfectly still, its ears forward, as if listening. Something about the intimacy of the moment made Maxwell turn away. The afternoon wore on, the champagne flowed, and the sun began its descent behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. As twilight approached, Maxwell signaled his staff, and lanterns illuminated the winding path to the new exhibition area. A palpable excitement swept through the crowd as they were guided toward what had been promoted as the evening's main attraction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maxwell announced, standing before the entrance to the glass-encased structures, "what you are about to see represents the culmination of a lifelong fascination with nature's most perfect creations, apex predators. These magnificent creatures embody power in its purest form." The guests murmured appreciatively as they filtered into the viewing area. Behind the first glass enclosure, a Bengal tiger paced with fluid grace. Beyond it, 2 cheetahs rested on a fabricated rock formation. But it was the final exhibit that drew gasps, a spacious habitat where Caesar, the male lion, regarded the intruders with regal indifference. "The king of beasts," Maxwell declared, "acquired at considerable expense and difficulty. A reminder of what true dominance looks like." As his guests crowded around the glass, Maxwell felt a familiar emptiness beneath his triumph. He'd expected more something, more awe, more envy, more of whatever it was he'd been chasing through each acquisition, each expansion of his empire. Instead, he found himself watching the lion's eyes, ancient, unimpressed, seeing through the spectacle to some truth Maxwell couldn't grasp. "Impressive," said George Whitman, his oldest rival in business and the man whose company Maxwell had most recently dismantled. "Though I've always found captive predators rather sad, all that power contained." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "They're better cared for here than in any zoo." "No doubt, but they're still performing for our amusement, aren't they?" Whitman raised his glass in a mock toast, "Rather like your board of directors before you fired them all." Before Maxwell could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance. A woman's voice, urgent and distressed, cut through the genteel conversation. Maxwell turned to see a kitchen worker, young, Hispanic, her uniform stained from the evening's work, scanning the crowd with panic in her eyes. "Miguel," she called, pushing past annoyed guests. "Miguel, where are you?" The house manager intercepted her, speaking in hushed but firm tones, trying to guide her back toward the service areas. But the woman broke free, continuing to call for her son. "This is unacceptable," Elaine Vanderholt sniffed nearby. "Really, Maxwell, the help should know their place." Something dark and uncomfortable stirred in Maxwell's chest. He remembered the boy in the entrance hall, freckles, unruly hair, eyes that had locked with his for just a moment. Before he could process the thought, another disturbance rippled through the crowd, this time from the direction of the lion enclosure. The boy, Miguel, had somehow slipped away from wherever he'd been told to wait. Now he stood pressed against the glass, small fingers splayed against the transparent barrier, eyes wide with wonder as he stared at Caesar. The lion had risen from his indifferent repose and approached the glass, massive head level with the child's. "Get that kid out of here," Maxwell ordered. But his words were lost in the sudden crescendo of reactions. Some guests delighted by the tableau, others horrified at the breach of etiquette, all of them watching. As the mother spotted her son and rushed toward him, Maxwell saw something in the interaction between boy and beast that pierced through his carefully constructed facade. The lion wasn't displaying aggression or predatory interest. Instead, the great animal seemed curious, almost gentle in its regard of the small human. And the boy showed no fear, only wonder. For a fraction of a second, Maxwell remembered another boy, another lifetime ago, standing outside a traveling circus tent in rural Pennsylvania, pressing his face against a canvas flap to glimpse the wonders inside because his mother couldn't afford tickets. Then the moment shattered as the house manager grabbed Miguel's shoulder, pulling him roughly away from the glass. The child stumbled, his mother reached for him, and the guests murmured with disapproval at the disruption. "Remove them," Maxwell said coldly, recovering his composure, "and ensure this doesn't happen again." As mother and child were escorted away, Maxwell became aware of a presence at the periphery of the gathering. Sarah Dawson stood at the edge of the light, the massive black stallion behind her. Her expression, visible even at this distance, held no admiration for his display of wealth and power, only a clear-eyed assessment that left him feeling strangely exposed. Maxwell turned away, clapping his hands to recapture his guests' attention. "Friends, this is merely the prelude. The true spectacle awaits us after dinner, when Caesar will demonstrate why he is indeed the king of beasts." The crowd's excitement rekindled, the incident with the boy already fading from their collective memory. But as Maxwell led them back toward the main house, he found himself unable to shake the image of the child's face reflected in the glass, mirroring the lion's golden eyes with the same ancient knowing gaze. Miguel Ramirez sat on an overturned bucket behind the kitchen, knees pulled to his chest, listening to the muffled sounds of the party. His mother, Elena, had brought him to work after Mrs. Peterson, their elderly neighbor who usually watched him, had been taken to the hospital with chest pains. The kitchen manager had reluctantly allowed it, tucking Miguel into a corner with strict instructions to stay out of sight. But 8-year-old boys aren't designed for stillness, and the sprawling estate had beckoned with irresistible mystery. He'd slipped away once, finding himself in the grand entrance hall with its marble floors and paintings of stern-faced strangers, before a man with cold eyes had noticed him. Then again, when the guests moved toward the animal enclosures, drawn by the same curiosity that pulls all children toward the wild and unknown. Now he was in trouble. His mother had been reprimanded, her job threatened. The memory of her face, tight with fear and embarrassment as she'd crouched before him, whispering urgent Spanish instructions to stay put, to be invisible, made his stomach hurt worse than hunger ever had. "Hey, kid," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Miguel looked up to see a young woman in dusty jeans approaching. She carried a worn leather satchel and moved with the easy confidence of someone who belonged outdoors. "You're Miguel, right? Elena's son?" Miguel nodded cautiously. "I'm Sarah. I work with the horses." She sat on a nearby crate without waiting for an invitation. "Rough night?" "I got Mama in trouble," he admitted, his voice small. Sarah considered this. "Seems to me Mr. Harrington's the one who decided to put wild animals on display for a bunch of rich folks who'd rather look at their phones than appreciate real beauty. That's not on you." A tentative smile touched Miguel's lips. "The lion was beautiful. He looked right at me." "Did he now?" Sarah's expression softened. Animals know things about people that people sometimes forget about themselves. She opened her satchel and pulled out an apple and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. I always pack extra. Hungry? Miguel hesitated, then nodded. As he ate, Sarah told him about the horses, how each had a different personality, how the chestnut mare loved carrots but hated apples, how the old gelding would only drink from the north side of his water trough. Miguel listened, the tight knot in his chest gradually loosening. "What about the black one?" he asked finally. "The really big one I saw you with." "Midnight?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "He's special. Most people are afraid of him because he's got a mind of his own. Mr. Harrington bought him at auction last year, but nobody could ride him. They were going to send him to slaughter before I convinced them to let me try." She leaned closer, as if sharing a secret. "Want to meet him?" Inside the main house, Maxwell Harrington moved through the final stages of his orchestrated evening. With mechanical precision, the dinner had been impeccable. 7 courses of culinary artistry served on century-old Limoges china. The wine, exclusively from vineyards he now owned, had flowed liberally. Now, as servers cleared dessert plates, he rose to address his guests. "The hour approaches for our grand finale," he announced. "If you'll proceed to the terrace, champagne awaits, along with a demonstration of natural law at its most elemental." But as guests excitedly speculated about what spectacle their host had prepared, Maxwell found himself distracted. The incident with the boy had left a hairline crack in his carefully constructed persona, a fissure through which unwelcome memories seeped like groundwater after a heavy rain. He excused himself to his study, ostensibly to prepare for the finale, but really to regain his composure. The room, with its leather-bound books and hunting trophies, had always reinforced his sense of achievement. Tonight, however, the glass eyes of mounted heads seemed to watch him with the same knowing indifference he'd seen in Caesar's gaze. Maxwell poured himself a scotch and moved to the window. Outside, the September moon illuminated the landscape in silver and shadow. Movement near the stables caught his eye. 2 figures, one tall and one small, walking toward the paddock where the black stallion was kept. The woman, Sarah, and the boy. Maxwell frowned. He'd given explicit instructions for the child to be kept out of sight. He should call security, have them removed. Instead, he found himself watching as Sarah opened the gate and led both, the boy and the horse, into the training ring. Even from this distance, Maxwell could appreciate the stallion's power. Midnight stood at least 17 hands high, his coat absorbing the moonlight rather than reflecting it. In the pale glow, the animal seemed sculpted from darkness itself. Yet despite his imposing size, the horse lowered his head gently as Sarah guided the boy's hand to touch his muzzle. Maxwell's mind drifted, suddenly and violently, to another moonlit night nearly 40 years earlier. His mother, young, beautiful, exhausted from working double shifts, had taken him to the county fair. They couldn't afford the rides or games, but a kind, stable hand had let 8-year-old Maxwell pet the draft horses that pulled the fair wagons. He remembered the warm velvet of the horse's nose, the animal's gentle breath against his palm, his mother's smile as she watched him, a smile that contained both love and sorrow because she couldn't give him more. The memory, long buried beneath achievements and acquisitions, ambushed him with its clarity. What had happened to that boy who'd been so easily delighted, who had marveled at the simple kindness of a stranger and the patient dignity of a working horse? A knock at the study door jolted him back to the present. "Everything is prepared, Mr. Harrington," his events coordinator said. "The guests are assembled on the terrace. The handler is ready with Caesar." Maxwell drained his scotch. "And the presentation?" "The calf has been secured in the demonstration area as you requested." The plan had seemed perfect when he'd conceived it months ago. a controlled hunt that would showcase Caesar's predatory prowess. The young calf, specially, selected for its size and color, would be released into a partitioned section of the enclosure. Floodlights would illuminate the scene as the barrier between predator and prey was lifted. Nature, red in tooth and claw, displayed for the titillation of guests who had seen everything but felt nothing. Now, standing in his study with the unexpected taste of childhood memories in his mouth, Maxwell felt the first tremor of doubt. "Sir, the guests are waiting." Maxwell nodded and followed his coordinator through the house to the terrace, where expectant faces turned toward him. Glasses of champagne sparkled in manicured hands. Conversations hushed as he took his place at the terrace's edge, overlooking the exhibition area now bathed in theatrical lighting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the night air. Throughout history, mankind has been fascinated by the primal dance between predator and prey. Tonight, you will witness this ancient ballet in its purest form. As he spoke, his eyes drifted beyond the illuminated enclosure to the training ring, where Sarah and Miguel were still engaged with Midnight. The boy was now standing on the lowest rail of the fence while Sarah supported him, allowing him to stroke the stallion's powerful neck. Even from this distance, Maxwell could see the child's expression of wonder and delight. "Mr. Harrington," his events coordinator prompted quietly, "shall we proceed?" Maxwell turned back to the expectant crowd. George Whitman stood front and center, a sardonic smile playing at his lips. Elaine Vanderholt clutched her pearls in anticipation. 200 pairs of eyes watched him, waiting for the blood sport he'd promised. "Of course," Maxwell said. "Begin." At his signal, a section of the enclosure wall retracted. In the newly revealed space, a small calf stood trembling, its white coat ghostly under the harsh lights. A second barrier, transparent but sturdy, still separated it from Caesar, who had risen to his feet at the scent of prey. "In a moment," Maxwell continued, "the final barrier will be removed. What follows is not entertainment, but education, a reminder of the natural order that exists beyond our civilized veneer." The crowd murmured with morbid excitement. Someone began a countdown. In the enclosure, Caesar's muscles tensed visibly beneath his tawny coat. The calf, sensing danger, tried to back away but found nowhere to go. And suddenly, with a clarity that felt like emerging from deep water, Maxwell saw the scene through different eyes. Not the eyes of the powerful man he'd become, but the eyes of the boy he'd once been, the boy who had marveled at horses and begged his mother to rescue wounded birds, who had cried when their neighbor's cat was hit by a car. That boy would be horrified by what the man was about to do. More disturbing. Still, he saw the scene through Miguel's eyes, a child who had looked at a lion and seen beauty, not threat, wonder, not fear. In the paddock, Midnight suddenly raised his head, nostrils flaring, as if he too sensed the impending violence. The stallion's ears flattened, and he pawed the ground restlessly. "Mr. Harrington," the handler's voice came through his earpiece. "On your command." Maxwell looked at the calf, white and innocent, at Caesar, magnificent and deadly, at his guests, eager for blood to spice their evening's entertainment, at Miguel, bathed in moonlight, his small hand resting trustingly on Midnight's powerful shoulder. And in that suspended moment, Maxwell Harrington, Acquisitions King, corporate, a raider, collector of power and possessions, felt something crack open inside him, like ice breaking over a winter lake. "No," he said quietly. His events coordinator leaned closer. "Sir?" I said no. Maxwell's voice grew stronger. "The demonstration is cancelled. Return the calf to the farm." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. George Whitman's eyebrows rose in surprise. Elaine Vanderholt's mouth formed a perfect O of disappointment. Ladies and gentlemen, Maxwell addressed the gathering, I must apologize for the change in program. Instead, I invite you to enjoy the remainder of your evening with more champagne and music in the garden. As his staff scrambled to redirect the confused guests, Maxwell stepped away from the terrace railing. His events coordinator followed, bewildered. Sir, if there was some problem with the arrangements, the problem, Maxwell interrupted, was with my judgment. See that the calf is safely returned, and find Elena Ramirez. Tell her I wish to speak with her. Maxwell walked away from the lights and noise of the party toward the shadowed paddock where a boy, a woman, and a horse stood in quiet communion. Each step felt like shedding a layer of the persona he'd constructed over decades. The ruthless businessman, the calculating host, the man who had everything but owned nothing of true value. Behind him, in the enclosure, Caesar settled back, onto his haunches, golden eyes watching the small white calf being led away. The lion's expression seemed almost approving, as if some ancient wisdom understood what the humans around him were only beginning to grasp, that true power lay not in destruction, but in mercy. Elena Ramirez stood straight-backed and terrified. In Maxwell Harrington's study, her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling. She'd been summoned after the strange cancellation of the evening's grand finale, whatever that had been, and fully expected to be fired. Jobs like hers in the kitchens of the wealthy were precarious at best. Bringing Miguel tonight had been a desperate measure, one she knew could cost her everything. Mrs. Ramirez, Maxwell said, gesturing to a chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Please sit. She remained standing. Sir? About my son. That's precisely what I wish to discuss. Maxwell moved to the window, looking out toward the paddock, where Sarah and Miguel were still visible in the moonlight. How long have you worked for me, Mrs. Ramirez? 2 years next month, sir. And in that time, I've never once spoken to you, have I? Elena swallowed. No, sir. Maxwell turned to face her, and Elena was startled by his expression. The cold arrogance she'd glimpsed earlier was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, uncertainty, perhaps, or a kind of strained recognition. Your son is quite remarkable, he said quietly. He looks at things differently. Elena's protective instincts flared. Miguel has a good heart. He meant no harm tonight. Harm? Maxwell shook his head. No, Mrs. Ramirez. Your son may have prevented harm. He hesitated, then continued, more deliberately. I've made arrangements for the remainder of the evening. The guests will be occupied with music and drinks. I'd like to speak with Miguel, if you'll permit it. Elena's confusion must have shown on her face. Not alone, Maxwell clarified. You'll be present, of course, and perhaps Miss Dawson as well. There's something I need to... He paused, seeming to struggle for words. Something I need to understand. At Ida, the paddock fence, Miguel was experiencing the most magical night of his young life. Sarah had shown him how to offer his palm to midnight, flat and open with a slice of apple in the center. The stallion's lips had tickled as they gathered the treat, making Miguel giggle. Now he was learning how horses communicate with their ears, how they could sense your feelings even when you tried to hide them. He knows you're a friend, Sarah explained, watching as Midnight gently nudged the boy's shoulder. Horses are excellent judges of character. Is that why he wouldn't let the other people ride him? Miguel asked, stroking the animal's sleek neck. Sarah smiled. Partly. He also needs to know you respect him. Most people try to control horses through fear or force. Midnight's too smart for that. He needs partnership. A movement at the edge of the ring caught her attention. Maxwell Harrington was approaching, accompanied by Eleanor. Sarah instinctively stepped closer to Miguel, one hand resting on Midnight's shoulder. The stallion's ears pricked forward, alert but not alarmed. "It's okay, boy," she murmured. Then to Miguel, "Your mum's here with Mr. Harrington. We'd better go see what they want." Miguel's face fell. "Am I in more trouble?" "Let's find out," Sarah said, taking his small hand in hers. They met at the gate of the paddock. Elena immediately drew Miguel to her side, her arm protective around his shoulders. But there was no anger in her face, only confusion and a cautious curiosity. "Mr. Harrington wants to talk with us," she said to her son in English, though she often spoke to him in Spanish at home. "About tonight." Maxwell regarded the boy with an intensity that made Sarah wary. Midnight, who had followed them to the gate, stretched his neck over the top rail, nostrils flaring as he assessed the newcomer. "Your horse seems concerned," Maxwell observed, keeping a respectful distance from the powerful animal. "He's protective," Sarah replied, "especially of Miguel." Maxwell nodded as if this confirmed something. "I've cancelled the evening's final event," he said, addressing both Sarah and Elena. "There was to be a demonstration with Caesar, something I now realize was unconscionable." Sarah's eyes narrowed. She'd heard rumors about the planned spectacle from other staff, something involving the lion and live prey. The thought had sickened her, but as a new employee still on probation, she'd felt powerless to object. "What changed your mind?" she asked bluntly. Maxwell's gaze returned to Miguel, who stood quietly watching the exchange, his dark eyes serious in his young face. "Perspective," he said finally. "I saw something tonight that reminded me of another time, another version of myself." He crouched down to Miguel's level, an awkward movement for a man unaccustomed to making himself smaller for anyone. "I understand you met Caesar today." Miguel nodded solemnly. "He has sad eyes." Something flickered across Maxwell's face, recognition, or perhaps pain. "Yes," he agreed, "I believe he does." He straightened, addressing Elena again. "Mrs. Ramirez, I'd like to offer your son something, with your permission, of course." Elena's arm tightened around Miguel. "What sort of something?" "Riding lessons," Maxwell said. "Ms. Dawson tells me he has a natural way with horses. Midnight in particular seems to have taken to him, which is remarkable, given that stallion's history." Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. In the month she'd worked at Crescent Ridge, Maxwell had never shown the slightest interest in the horses beyond their value as status symbols. She'd assumed he was like most of the wealthy owners she'd worked for, in love with the idea of horses rather than the animals themselves. "That's very generous, Mr. Harrington," Elena said carefully. "But we live in town, and the bus doesn't come out this far. I couldn't bring him regularly." "I've considered that," Maxwell replied. "There's a cottage on the property, near the old orchard. It was the original caretaker's home, though it hasn't been used in years. It would need renovation, but once completed it could provide housing for you and Miguel, closer to work for you, and convenient for his lessons." Elena stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, I don't understand." Maxwell seemed to struggle again, as if navigating unfamiliar emotional terrain. "Mrs. Ramirez, I've spent my life acquiring things. Companies, properties, possessions. Tonight I realized I've forgotten the difference between owning and caring, between power and responsibility." He glanced at Midnight, who was still watching him intently. "Your son reminded me of that distinction. This is not charity, it's restitution of a sort." In the silence that followed, Midnight nudged Miguel's shoulder again, making the boy smile, despite the tension of the adult conversations swirling around him. Sarah watched Maxwell's expression as he observed this interaction, the powerful black horse and the small boy, connected by a wordless trust. Something in the man's face had softened, revealing glimpses of someone else beneath the polished exterior of wealth and influence. "Perhaps," Maxwell continued, addressing Miguel directly now, You might show me how you made friends with Midnight. I've owned him for over a year, and he's never allowed me near him." Miguel looked to his mother, who nodded encouragingly, then to Sarah, who gave him a reassuring smile. "You have to be quiet inside," the boy explained, leading Maxwell to the fence. "And you can't want anything from him. You just have to see him." "See him?" Maxwell repeated, puzzled. "Not just with your eyes," Miguel clarified with the simple wisdom of childhood. "With your heart, like he sees you." Sarah produced an apple from her pocket and handed it to Maxwell. "Hold it flat on your palm," she instructed, "and follow Miguel's lead." What followed was a lesson in humility that none of the adults would soon forget. Miguel demonstrated how to approach without demand or expectation, how to offer respect before seeking connection. Maxwell, under the boy's earnest tutelage, gradually set aside the commanding presence that had defined him in boardrooms and business dealings. Midnight watched the transformation with the equine equivalent of skepticism, but eventually, cautiously, stretched his neck toward the offered apple. "Don't move," Miguel whispered as the stallion's lips carefully gathered the fruit from Maxwell's hand. "He's deciding if he trusts you." The simple touch, horse's mouth against human palm, lasted only seconds. But in that brief connection, something profound passed between man and animal. Maxwell stood perfectly still, his expression one of wonder that mirrored what Miguel had shown earlier. When Midnight finally withdrew, tossing his proud head as if satisfied with some private conclusion, Maxwell released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you," he said, and Sarah wasn't sure if he was addressing Miguel or the horse. Across the property, the sounds of the party continued. Music, laughter, the clinking of glasses. But here in the paddock, a different kind of gathering had formed. 4 humans and 1 horse, connected by an unexpected moment of authenticity that had somehow cut through layers of social division, wealth disparity, and the carefully constructed barriers that usually kept them apart. Elena watched her son with a mixture of pride and astonishment. Miguel had always been sensitive, attuned to the feelings of others in a way that sometimes worried her. In their small apartment in town, with its thin walls and limited space, his emotional intuition often seemed like a burden. Here, under the vast Virginia sky, surrounded by open land and a horse that responded to his gentle spirit, Miguel appeared transformed, more confident, more himself. "He needs this," she said quietly to Maxwell. "The space, the animals. He's always been different from other children, more serious, more aware. In town, at school, the other kids." She trailed off, not wanting to give voice to the bullying, the isolation her son often faced. Maxwell nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. "I was like him once," he admitted, watching as Miguel showed Sarah something he'd noticed about Midnight's ear movements. Sensitive, aware of things other people missed. A shadow crossed his face. "Life taught me to bury those qualities, to see them as weaknesses rather than strengths." "They're not weaknesses," Elena said firmly, "not in Miguel and not in you." The directness of her statement seemed to surprise Maxwell. For a moment, the power dynamic between employer and employee dissolved, replaced by the simpler truth of one parent recognizing another's buried pain. "No," he agreed after a pause. "They're not. I'm beginning to remember that." As the night deepened around them, the party at the main house began to wind down. Guests departed in luxury vehicles, their drivers navigating the long, winding driveway with practiced precision. The catering staff cleared crystal and china, returning the house to its immaculate state. In the animal enclosures, Caesar and the other predators settled into their nighttime routines, their brief role as entertainment already forgotten. But in the paddock, something new was taking shape. Maxwell, with Elena's cautious permission, had extended his conversation with Miguel. The boy was now explaining his theory about why Caesar had seemed sad, because the lion remembered being free, just as people remember being happy, even when they're not anymore. "And do you think Caesar can be happy again?" Maxwell asked, genuinely curious about the child's perspective. Miguel considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher. Maybe, if he had more space and other lions to be with, and if people didn't just look at him like he was a thing. From the mouth of a child, the critique was devastating in its simplicity. Maxwell glanced at Sarah, who had been watching the exchange with a thoughtful expression. "There are sanctuaries," she said, answering his unspoken question. "Places where former zoo and circus animals can live out their lives in more natural settings. Not complete freedom, but better than—" She gestured toward the exhibition area, now dark and silent. "Find one," Maxwell said decisively. "The best one. Make arrangements for Caesar and the others, whatever the cost." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she nodded. "I'll start research tomorrow." As the conversation continued, Midnight remained close to Miguel, occasionally lowering his head to the boy's shoulder as if offering reassurance or seeking it. The stallion's presence had a calming effect on the group, his steady breathing and watchful gaze creating a center around which their unexpected connection could form. When Miguel finally began to yawn, Elena gently suggested it was time to go. The boy's reluctance was evident, but tempered by Maxwell's renewed promise about the cottage and the riding lessons. "You'll come back tomorrow?" Sarah asked Miguel, as she helped him give Midnight a final pat goodnight. "Can I, Mama?" Miguel looked up at Elena with pleading eyes. "You have school tomorrow," she reminded him, "but perhaps on the weekend, if Mr. Harrington still wishes it." "I do," Maxwell confirmed. "In fact, I've been thinking, the renovation of the cottage will take time. In the interim, perhaps you'd consider a temporary arrangement. There are several unused guest suites in the east wing of the main house. You and Miguel could stay there until the cottage is ready." Elena hesitated, clearly caught between practical need and maternal caution. "That's very generous, but—" "The offer stands," Maxwell said, recognizing her reservation. "Think about it overnight. Whatever you decide, Miguel is welcome here, as are you." As they prepared to leave, Midnight suddenly tossed his head and snorted, drawing everyone's attention. The stallion pawed at the ground once, twice, his ears pricked forward toward something beyond the paddock. "What is it, boy?" Sarah murmured, scanning the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows near the main house. George Whitman, Maxwell's business rival, walking unsteadily toward them. His bow tie hung undone around his neck, and he carried a half-empty tumbler of what was likely very expensive scotch. "Maxwell," he called, his voice carrying across the night air, "leaving your own party to play with the help? How democratic of you." Maxwell stiffened, the openness he'd shown during the past hour instantly replaced by a guarded wariness. "George, I thought you'd left." "Almost. But I was curious about this sudden attack of conscience." Whitman approached the group, his gaze sliding dismissively over Elena and Miguel before focusing on Maxwell with alcohol-sharpened malice. "First you cancel your little lion show, then you disappear with the kitchen staff. Not your usual style." Midnight snorted again, more forcefully, and backed several steps away from the fence, positioning himself protectively near Miguel. Sarah laid a calming hand on the stallion's neck, though her own expression had hardened at Whitman's tone. "It's late, George," Maxwell said evenly. "I'll have my driver take you home." Whitman ignored this, his attention now fixed on Miguel. "This, the kid who caused the scene earlier? Got to hand it to you, boy. You've got our host wrapped around your finger. What's your secret?" Miguel shrank against his mother. uncomfortable under the man's sardonic scrutiny. Elena straightened her shoulders, her protective instinct overriding her usual deference. "We were just leaving, sir," she said firmly. "Miguel, come." As she guided her son away, Whitman called after them, "Better watch yourself, Maxwell. People might think you've gone soft. First the animals, now this little charity project. What's next? Giving away your fortune to homeless shelters." The contempt in his voice hung in the air like smoke. Sarah expected Maxwell to respond with equal venom, to reassert the coldly powerful persona she'd glimpsed during her brief employment. Instead, something unexpected happened. Midnight, still agitated by Whitman's presence, suddenly reared up, powerful forelegs pawing the air. The display wasn't aggressive exactly, but it was unmistakably a statement, a thunderous reminder of natural power that owed nothing to wealth or social position. In the moment of startled silence that followed, Maxwell Harrington laughed. Not the calculated chuckle he deployed at business functions, but a genuine sound of surprised delight. "You know, George," he said as Midnight settled back to all fours, still watching the intruder with alert wariness, "I think I prefer the horse's opinion to yours." He turned to Elena and Miguel, who had paused at this unexpected development. "Mrs. Ramirez, I'll have my driver take you and Miguel home. We can continue our discussion tomorrow if you're willing." Elena nodded, a small smile playing at her lips despite her continued confusion at the evening's strange turns. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." As they walked away, Miguel glanced back once at Midnight, raising his small hand in farewell. The stallion responded with a soft nicker that seemed to carry across the night air like a promise. Left alone with Whitman, Maxwell turned to his longtime rival with new clarity. "You should go home, George. Sleep it off." Whitman regarded him with narrowed eyes. "Whatever game you're playing, Harrington, it won't work. The market knows who you are. One night of playing savior to Mexican kitchen help won't change that." Maxwell felt a flash of the old anger, the reflexive need to dominate, to crush opposition. But behind it came something else, pity. For the first time, he saw George Whitman not as an opponent to be defeated, but as a mirror of what he himself had been becoming, a man so consumed by competition and acquisition that he'd lost sight of his own humanity. "Good night, George," Maxwell said simply, turning away to follow Sarah as she led Midnight back to his stall. Behind them, Whitman stood alone in the moonlight, the expensive scotch bitter in his mouth, watching as something he couldn't quite name slipped beyond. His grasp, autumn-painted Virginia's horse country in blazing hues of crimson and gold as September yielded to October. At Crescent Ridge, the transformation extended beyond the changing leaves to the very heart of the estate itself. The once imposing gates now stood open more frequently, welcoming a steady stream of contractors, animal welfare specialists, and community members who had never before crossed the property's threshold. The exotic animal enclosures had been dismantled. Caesar and the other captive predators had been carefully transported to sanctuaries where they could live in more natural settings, not true freedom, but a vast improvement over their previous confinement. The glass and steel that had imprisoned them was being repurposed for a greenhouse and educational center, where local school children would learn about conservation and responsible stewardship. The caretaker's cottage near the old orchard hummed with activity as workers restored its stone walls and timber beams. Elena had accepted Maxwell's offer of temporary accommodation in the main house, though she'd insisted on continuing her kitchen duties despite his assurance that it wasn't necessary. Miguel, meanwhile, had become a fixture at the stables, arriving each day after school to help Sarah with the horses and receive his riding lessons. On this particular afternoon, Maxwell stood at his study window, watching as Miguel led Midnight around the training ring, The boy had proven to have an exceptional gift with horses, particularly with the once unapproachable stallion, who now followed him with the devoted attention of a long-time companion. Sarah supervised from the fence, occasionally offering guidance, but mostly allowing the natural partnership between child and horse to flourish on its own terms. A knock at the door interrupted Maxwell's thoughts. "Come in," he called, turning. From the window, Pastor David Williams entered, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. The minister from the small church in town had become a regular visitor since Maxwell had reached out about establishing a community foundation. "Hope I'm not interrupting," David said, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "Saw you watching. Miguel and that magnificent horse of yours." "Midnight belongs more to Miguel than to me these days," Maxwell replied, gesturing for his visitor to take a seat. "Though I'm not sure ownership is the right concept anymore. Partnership seems more accurate." David nodded, understanding the deeper shift this simple statement represented. "Speaking of partnerships, I've brought the final proposals for the community center." He opened his portfolio and spread several documents across Maxwell's desk. The town council approved the location. That abandoned warehouse by the river turns out to be perfect, close to the neighborhoods that need services, most but accessible to everyone. Maxwell studied the architectural renderings. The planned facility would provide after-school programs, job training, and health services to a community that had long been overlooked by the wealthy residents of the surrounding countryside. It represented a significant portion of his fortune, but money that now seemed better invested in people than in acquisitions. Miguel's mother asked if there might be space for ESL classes, he mentioned, tracing the outline of a classroom on the blueprint. "Many of the kitchen staff and groundskeepers have expressed interest. Easily arranged," David assured him. "Elena's become quite the advocate since you appointed her to the planning committee. She's got a natural talent for seeing what people need." Maxwell smiled, remembering Elena's initial reluctance to join the committee, her fear that her accent and limited education would make her contributions unwelcome. In the weeks since, she had emerged as one of the most insightful voices in the planning process, bringing perspectives that would have otherwise been entirely absent. "Have you given any more thought to the naming?" David asked, gathering up the approved plans. "The board is eager to make an announcement." Maxwell shook his head. "No family names. The foundation should belong to the community, not to me. If anything..." He paused, considering. "Perhaps something that honors the principal rather than the donor. Midnight Foundation has a certain resonance." David raised an eyebrow. "After the horse?" "After what the horse represents," Maxwell clarified. "Dignity that can't be purchased, loyalty that must be earned, the wisdom to distinguish between the two." Outside, Miguel had finished his lesson. Sarah was helping him remove Midnight's halter and brush him down, tasks the boy approached with solemn responsibility, despite needing to stand on a mounting block to reach the stallion's back. Midnight stood patiently, occasionally turning, his head to check on his young handler's progress. "You've changed, Maxwell," David observed, following his gaze. "When I first got your call last month, I half expected it was some sort of tax strategy or publicity stunt. I'm glad to have been wrong." Maxwell accepted this with a nod. The pastor wasn't the only one who had been skeptical of his sudden transformation. The business press had speculated wildly about his motives when he'd announced his intention to restructure his holdings and establish the foundation. His board members had resisted until he'd made it clear that his decision was non-negotiable. George Whitman had been the most vocal critic, publicly questioning Maxwell's mental stability and privately attempting to rally shareholders against him. None of it mattered. For the first time in decades, Maxwell was acting from conviction rather than calculation. The change had begun that night with Miguel and Midnight, but it had deepened with each subsequent choice, each step away from the man he'd become, and toward the man he'd once had the potential to be. The cottage should be ready next week, he told David as they walked toward the door. Though Elena says Miguel will miss being close to the stables, David chuckled. That boy would sleep in Midnight's stall if she let him. Speaking of which, will you be attending his school presentation tomorrow? I understand he's quite nervous. About it, Maxwell hesitated. He'd promised Miguel he would be there, but a critical meeting with international investors had been scheduled for the same time. In his previous life, there would have been no question. Business always took precedence. Now, he found himself recalibrating his priorities daily. I'll be there, he decided. The investors can wait. After David departed, Maxwell returned to the window. Miguel had finished with Midnight and was now sitting cross-legged in the grass outside the paddock, apparently deep in conversation with Sarah. The trainer's expression was serious as she listened to whatever the boy was saying, nodding occasionally in that way adults do when children are sharing something important to them. Maxwell felt a now familiar ache in his chest, part regret for years wasted chasing empty achievements, part gratitude for the unexpected second chance he'd been given. He thought often these days of his own mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion trying to give him opportunities, and who had died before seeing whether her sacrifices would bear fruit. What would she think of the man he'd become? What would she think of the man he was trying to become now? The sound of Elena's voice drew his attention to the doorway. She stood there with a folder of household accounts she'd been helping to organize, another responsibility she'd taken on with surprising skill. Mr. Harrington, I've finished the review you asked for, she said, still formal despite his repeated invitations to call him Maxwell. There were several discrepancies in the catering invoices from last month. Thank you, Elena. And please, it's just Maxwell, he reminded her gently, especially since we're practically housemates now. She smiled, her reserve softening slightly. Old habits. In the kitchen we were trained never to address the owner by first name. Well, I'm trying to be something other than just the owner these days. He gestured toward the window. Miguel seems to be making progress with Midnight. Elena moved to look outside, maternal pride evident in her expression. Sarah says he has a gift. She wants him to help with some of the rescued horses coming next month, the ones from that bad situation in Kentucky. Maxwell nodded. The rescue of 20 neglected horses from a bankrupt breeding farm had been Sarah's initiative, but he'd immediately offered Crescent Ridge as a rehabilitation facility. The expenses were considerable, but the project had given new purpose to both the property and its staff. Will you come to his presentation tomorrow? Elena asked, a hint of anxiety in her voice. He's been practicing every night. It means so much to him that you said you would attend. I'll be there, Maxwell assured her, front row. Her relief was palpable. Thank you. He's never had... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Miguel's father left before he was born. There haven't been many men in his life who've shown interest in his accomplishments. The simple statement cut through Maxwell like a blade. How many people had he encountered in his life, employees, associates, even family members, whose needs and hopes he'd dismissed as irrelevant to his ambitions? How many Miguels had he passed by without seeing? I'll be there, he repeated, more firmly this time. Later that evening, after dinner had been cleared and Elena had taken Miguel to the east wing where they were staying, Maxwell found himself drawn back to the stables. The night was clear and cool, the first hint of frost silvering the grass as he walked the path that had become increasingly familiar over the past weeks. The stable was quiet, most of the horses already settled for the night. A single light burned in Sarah's office, where she was likely finishing paperwork for the upcoming rescue operation. Maxwell moved past, heading for Midnight's stall at the end of the row. The stallion was awake, his dark eyes gleaming in the dim light as Maxwell approached. Once those eyes had held wariness, even hostility, now they regarded him with what he liked to think was cautious acceptance, not the unquestioning trust the horse showed Miguel, but a truce of sorts between two beings who had each, in their way, been transformed by a child's perception. "Hello, old friend," Maxwell said quietly, stopping at a respectful distance from the stall door. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Midnight nickered softly, neither invitation nor rejection. Maxwell took it as permission to lean against the stall door, breathing in the comforting sense of hay, horse, and the sweet autumn air filtering through the stable's open windows. "I'm attending a third-grade presentation tomorrow," he told the horse, feeling only slightly foolish for the one-sided conversation. "About animal habitats, did you know Miguel has been researching horse sanctuaries? Sarah's been helping him. I think you've inspired a future conservationist." Midnight flicked an ear, which Maxwell chose to interpret as interest. "I used to mock people like the man I'm becoming," he continued, more to himself than to the horse. "I thought their concerns were sentimental, their compassion a weakness to be exploited. I built an empire on that belief." He sighed, the sound loud in the quiet stable. "Now I'm dismantling that empire piece by piece, and I find I don't miss it at all. Isn't that strange?" The stallion shifted, moving closer to where Maxwell stood. After a moment's hesitation, the horse extended his neck, nostrils flaring as he took in Maxwell's scent. It was a gesture of curiosity rather than affection, but it felt like progress nonetheless. Slowly, giving the animal plenty of time to withdraw if he chose, Maxwell raised his hand. Midnight regarded it warily, then, to Maxwell's surprise, allowed. The briefest contact, his velvet muzzle brushing against Maxwell's palm for just a moment before he retreated to the back of the stall. The simple touch resonated through Maxwell with unexpected power. Not a dramatic transformation like in children's stories, where the beast suddenly becomes a devoted companion, but something more honest, a moment of genuine connection between two beings who were still learning to trust. "Thank you, Maxwell," said softly. A sound at the stable entrance made him turn. Miguel stood in the doorway, a small figure in pajamas and slippers, his dark hair tousled as if he'd been tossing in his sleep. "Miguel, is everything all right?" Maxwell asked, moving away from Midnight's stall. The boy nodded. "I couldn't sleep. Mama said I could come check on Midnight if I put on my coat." He held up the garment as evidence, though he hadn't actually put it on. Maxwell helped him into the coat, noting how small the child's shoulders felt beneath the fabric. "Midnight's fine. I was just keeping him company for a while." Miguel studied him with that direct gaze that always made Maxwell feel transparent. "Were you talking to him?" Caught out, Maxwell nodded. "I was. Do you think that's silly?" "No," Miguel said seriously. "Horses understand more than people think. That's what Sarah says." She's probably right about that. Maxwell glanced back at the stall, where Midnight had returned to the front, clearly interested in his young friend's arrival. "He let me touch his nose just now. Not for long, but he didn't seem angry about it." Miguel's face brightened. "That's good. He's starting to trust you." The simple assessment warmed something in Maxwell's chest. "I hope so. Trust takes time, doesn't it?" Sarah says you have to prove yourself trustworthy over and over before some horses believe you, especially if they've been hurt before." Maxwell wondered, not for the first time, how much the boy intuited about adult complexities he was too young to fully understand. That sounds like good advice for dealing with people too. Miguel nodded solemnly. "Mama says the same thing." They stood together in companionable silence, watching as midnight shifted and settled in his stall. The stallion seemed content with their presence, his earlier wariness replaced by a calm acceptance. "Are you nervous about your presentation tomorrow?" Maxwell asked after a while. Miguel scuffed one slippered foot against the stable floor. "A little. The other kids might think it's dumb." "Why would they think that?" "Because it's about horses and how they need protection. Some of the boys in my class say horses are boring unless they're in races or movies." Maxwell considered this. "You know, I used to think that way too. I bought Midnight because he was valuable and impressive, not because I appreciated him for himself." He looked down at the boy's serious face. "I was wrong. You helped me see that." Miguel seemed to weigh this admission. "So you think my presentation is good?" "I think it's important," Maxwell said honestly. "When you care about something enough to tell others why it matters, that's never dumb. That's how change happens." The boy's expression eased, some of his worry visibly lifting. "Will you really be there? Some of the kids' parents can't come." "Because they have to work." "I'll be there," Maxwell promised for the third time that day, each repetition cementing his commitment more firmly. "Front row!" Miguel yawned suddenly, the late hour catching up with him. "I should go back. Mama will worry." "I'll walk you," Maxwell offered, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. As they left the stable, Miguel turned for one last look. At midnight. "Good night," he called softly. "Sleep well." The stallion nickered in response, a sound that seemed to follow them like a blessing as they walked back to the house through the frost-touched grass. The following afternoon, Maxwell sat in an undersized chair in the third-grade classroom of Oakwood Elementary School, feeling simultaneously conspicuous and invisible. Around him, parents chatted familiarly with each other, many in work uniforms or casual clothes that contrasted sharply with his tailored suit. He'd come directly from the office, having rescheduled the investor meeting despite his CFO's protests. Elena sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the small presentation area at the front of the room where students' projects were displayed on a bulletin board. Miguel's poster, featuring carefully drawn horses and habitats, was positioned slightly apart from the others. "He worked so hard on it," she whispered, noticing Maxwell's gaze. 3 nights of cutting pictures and practicing his speech." Before Maxwell could respond, the teacher, a young woman with bright eyes and an air of enthusiastic commitment, called the class to order. "Parents and special guests, thank you for coming to our Habitat Presentation Day. Each student has researched an environment and the animals that live there. They'll tell us what these habitats need to stay healthy and why that matters to all of us." One by one, children presented their projects. Rainforests, oceans, deserts, each with their characteristic species and challenges. The parents applauded supportively after each presentation, regardless of quality or preparation. Maxwell found himself genuinely engaged, impressed by the seriousness with which these young people approached environmental concerns that his generation had often dismissed. When Miguel's turn came, Elena tensed beside him. The boy walked to the front of the room with his poster, his face solemn with concentration. Several of his classmates whispered to each other, and one boy at the back made a quiet but distinct neighing sound that caused a ripple of giggles. Miguel faltered momentarily, his eyes seeking his mother in the audience. Then his gaze shifted to Maxwell, who gave him an encouraging nod. The boy straightened his shoulders and began. "My habitat is horse country," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Not just where horses live now, but where they should be able to live. Horses were here before people built cities and farms. They need open space and clean water and other horses to be with." He pointed to different sections of his poster as he continued, explaining how wild horse populations had dwindled, how domestic horses sometimes suffered from neglect or mistreatment, and how sanctuaries and preserves were trying to help. His presentation was simple but heartfelt, informed by his experiences with Midnight and Sarah's lessons about horse behavior and needs. Some people think horses are just for riding or racing or showing, Miguel concluded, his eyes now moving confidently across the audience. But they're alive and they feel things just like us. They deserve respect and care. That's why habitats for horses matter. Thank you. The applause that followed was genuine, led by Elena's proud clapping and Maxwell's wholehearted participation. Even the boy who had made the neighing sound seemed impressed, if grudgingly so. As Miguel returned to his seat, glowing with relief and accomplishment, Maxwell felt a profound sense of rightness. This moment, sitting in an elementary school classroom, applauding a child's simple plea for compassion toward animals, seemed more meaningful than any business triumph he'd ever achieved. After the presentations, as parents and children mingled over juice and cookies, Maxwell found himself approached by Miguel's teacher. "Mr. Harrington," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Ms. Collins. Thank you for coming today. Miguel was so excited that you'd be here." "The pleasure was mine," Maxwell replied sincerely. "He did an excellent job." Ms. Collins nodded, her expression thoughtful. "He's a special child, very empathetic, very aware. Sometimes that makes school social dynamics challenging for him." She glanced toward where Miguel stood with Elena, proudly showing her the comments Ms. Collins had written on his project. "Having supportive adults makes all the difference for children like him." Before Maxwell could respond, Miguel spotted him and hurried over, project in hand. "Did you like it?" he asked eagerly. "I remembered everything Sarah taught me about how horses communicate." "It was excellent," Maxwell assured him. "Very professional, in fact." He knelt to the boy's level, an action that was becoming more natural with practice. "I have a proposition for you. The foundation I'm starting is going to include programs about animal welfare. Would you consider being our first youth advisor? We need someone who understands why these issues matter to young people." Miguel's eyes widened. "A real advisor, like in meetings and everything?" "Real meetings," Maxwell confirmed. "Your perspective would be valuable." The boy looked to his mother, who had followed him over. "Can I, Mama?" Elena's eyes shone with a mixture of pride and something more complex, perhaps recognition of how far they had come from that night in the kitchen when she had feared for her job and her son's future. "Of course, mijo, if that's what you want." "Then, yes." Miguel turned back to Maxwell with a grin that transformed his serious face. "I accept the position." Maxwell laughed, offering his hand for a formal shake that Miguel returned with endearing gravity. "It's settled then. We'll work out the details later." As they gathered Miguel's things and prepared to leave, the boy suddenly remembered something. "We have to tell Midnight," he exclaimed. "He'll want to know about my presentation and my new job." "I'm sure he's very interested in both," Maxwell agreed, exchanging an amused glance with Elena. Outside the school, as they walked toward Maxwell's car where his driver waited, Miguel skipped ahead, energy restored by his success and the promise of seeing his equine friend. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, watching her son. "Not just for coming today, but for everything. The cottage, the foundation work, the way you've been with Miguel." She hesitated, then added, "It's changed him. Having someone believe in him this way, he's more confident, more himself." Maxwell considered her words, feeling their weight and truth. "If anyone should be thanking anyone, it's me thanking him. And you." He looked at her directly. "I was lost, Elena. surrounded by everything money could buy, but I'd forgotten what actually matters. Miguel reminded me. You both did. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, accepting his gratitude with the same quiet dignity with which she approached everything. People can change, she said simply, when they choose to. Ahead of them, Miguel had reached the car and was animatedly telling the driver about his presentation. The autumn sun slanted through the trees lining the school parking lot, gilding the scene in warm light that seemed to reflect the moment's promise, not an ending, but a beginning. That evening, as twilight settled over Crescent Ridge, Maxwell stood again at his study window. Below, in the training ring illuminated by floodlights, Sarah was giving Miguel an extra riding lesson, a reward for his successful presentation. For the first time, the boy was actually mounted on Midnight, the stallion moving with exaggerated care beneath his small rider. Elena watched from the fence, her posture reflecting both maternal concern and growing confidence in her son's abilities. Maxwell observed the scene with a fullness in his chest that he was slowly learning to recognize as contentment. The journey ahead would not be simple, dismantling parts of his business empire while redirecting resources toward more meaningful purposes, renovating not just a cottage, but an entire life's philosophy, earning trust that his change of heart was genuine and lasting. There would be resistance, skepticism, setbacks. But watching Miguel sit tall in the saddle, his small hands holding the reins with reverent attention, his face alight with joy, Maxwell knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found the right path. Not power over others, but service to them. Not possession, but stewardship. Not isolation in wealth, but connection through compassion. In the ring, Midnight completed a perfect circle, responding to Miguel's gentle guidance with the willing cooperation of a true partner. The stallion's stride was measured, his powerful body controlled not through force, but through mutual respect, a living embodiment of the lesson Maxwell was still learning. As darkness fell completely and stars appeared above the Virginia hills, Maxwell turned from the window, leaving the study light burning behind him as he went to join the small gathering in the ring, not as owner or benefactor, but simply as part of something authentic and alive, a community being born beneath the ancient, knowing stars.